The rhetoric coming from senior Iranian officials suggests a broader framing of the conflict, linking Iran, Lebanon, and Palestine into a single front and signaling no willingness to back down in negotiations. At the same time, there's little indication that Washington has real leverage over Israel or a clear path to de-escalation. Does this make renewed conflict inevitable? And what options, if any, does the U.S. actually have left to contain it?
Well, I'm hoping that Iran was able to play the stock market on this, do what Trump's been doing. So Trump, over the last, now we're going on 13 weeks. What he would do is he would announce, hey, we got a peace agreement. This should be signed any day now. We're close. We're so close. And as a result, what would happen? The price of oil would go down. The price in the stock market would go up. And so by shorting stocks or buying puts where you could profit off of these changes. So if I'm Iran, I'd start by, I'd set up a company where you can put, invest billions and just come out and say, nope, hey, the negotiations are off. In fact, we're getting ready to deploy a nuclear weapon. Oh man, the stock market would go crazy. They could cash in on that, Now, I don't think they're doing that, but that would be, it's just a reminder that the other spillover effects of this conflict, that if you've been watching the U.S. stock market, it has been behaving as if there is an actual deal almost in the bag. It's close, so close. And, there have been some of us who's saying, no, that ain't happening. It's not true. Stop getting taken in by, this is another version of Donald Trump is like Lucy from the Charles Schultz, Charlie Brown cartoon. Lucy would hold out the football. Come on, Charlie, kick it. And Charlie would come running up and try to kick it. And she'd pull the ball away. He'd fly up in the air and land on his ass. That's been Donald Trump. Now, 13 weeks. Oh, we got a deal. It's almost, we're close. We're close. Now, as Iran said, we're not even talking to the United States now. There's nothing to talk about until the issues of the Palestinians and the Lebanese are addressed. Have a nice day.
It seems increasingly difficult to sustain the current situation in the Gulf, with the blockade on Iran raising the risk of direct confrontation and a broader U.S.-Iran war. At the same time, that brings into question Israel's defensive capacity in the event of renewed escalation. If the conflict reignites, how capable is the United States of actually defending Israel against a more sustained and coordinated response?
Yeah, the Iron Dome is designed to intercept, let's call them subsonic rockets. It is not designed to deal with supersonic or hypersonic ballistic missiles. The fact of the matter is, neither is the Patriot missile, the PAC-3. It's not. It's proven ineffective. But let's say it was effective. The United States doesn't have enough. They have effectively run out. It just, all we can do is public accounting, and the total number of missiles in the U.S. inventory, the most generous assumptions would put it over 6,000, about 6,400 at the end of 2025. So as of 5 months ago. Now, since then, they've probably added, again, to be generous, another 300, 60 per month, 5 months. Maybe, because the other, though, issue is China's cut off rare earth minerals, which are essential ingredients. It's like trying to bake a cake and not using any sugar or flour. You're not going to have a cake. So here's, but with that, 6,400, and then when you do the math, you got to fire two Patriots at a minimum to intercept an incoming threat. So that means that 6,400 is capable of defeating 3,200 missiles fired. That's assuming that all of that was retained by the United States, except we know for a fact that at least 1,500 to 2,000 of those PAC-3 missiles went to foreign governments: Saudi Arabia, South Korea, Japan, Australia. So you subtract that. Well, now we're down to 4,400, which means, okay, we can intercept 2,200 missiles. Okay, how many? And we gave 1,000 in addition to the 2,000 sold to foreign governments. We gave another 1,000 to Ukraine. So that 1,000 missiles. That means they could intercept up to 500 incoming at targets by Russia. Well, hell, just was it a week ago? Russia fired equivalent of more than 500 missiles on one day. So you see, the numbers just don't add up. So this is the living with the reality is that Israel and the United States do not have an effective air defense system. They don't have it. It does not exist.
Larry, Trump described Venezuela as a one-day win and suggested Iran's military has already been largely defeated, yet the situations on the ground appear far more complicated than that narrative suggests. In Venezuela, for example, there was never really a conventional war in the way he seems to imply. Does this kind of rhetoric reflect genuine confidence inside the administration, or is it creating expectations that could become difficult to sustain if these conflicts continue to escalate rather than quickly resolve?
Yeah, that was an inside job. Three individuals that were part of Maduro's security team, and I mean we're talking senior people, coordinated, conspired with the United States to disable Venezuelan air defense systems, to pave the way for U.S. Special Operations Forces to go in and grab him. Big difference from big difference from what's going on now with respect to Iran. This isn't a 1 day. This wasn't a 4 day operation. This is, look at it's 3 months and 2 days. Started on the 28th, so you got all of March, all of April, all of May, and now the first day of June. So it is. Trump's lost control of the narrative.
Do you see Iran's position hardening at this stage, or is there still room for flexibility?
As of today, it's much harder. They said negotiations. We're breaking off negotiations. We're not going to talk to the United States now until they come back with a serious deal, an agreement to stop the killing in Lebanon and in Palestine.
Larry, in that interview, Trump framed the Strait of Hormuz issue as something that must be opened immediately, with no restrictions, while also tying it directly to Iran's nuclear ambitions and broader energy dominance claims. He also argued that the U.S. is now an oil superpower, and therefore less dependent on the Strait than before. How realistic is this framing of U.S. leverage over the Strait of Hormuz, and does it actually reduce American vulnerability in a potential confrontation with Iran?
Yeah, that's a lie. That's flat out not true. Or it's in terms of crude oil, the Russia and China combined produce more than the United States in terms of crude oil. The United States, if you count in all
Russia and Venezuela.
Yeah. Well, but Russia and Saudi Arabia. That's what
Saudi Arabia.
Yeah. If you count in, so he gets to that number where if you look at all petroleum-related products, including liquid natural gas and et cetera. Yes, the United States produces a little more total than Saudi and Russia combined. However, the United States oil that it produces is, we'll put it in terms of alcohol. I liked how this fellow that Danny Davis interviewed, Art Berman, referred to it. You got your light beer, you got your wine, and then you got your hard liquor, your tequila and your whiskey. The oil that the United States produces is light. It's like light beer. It's good for producing gasoline and maybe aviation fuel, but it is not good, and you really can't produce diesel with it. So as a result, it is true that the United States is a net exporter of this light oil. A lot of that goes to Europe, but it's a net importer of diesel. And where does it get that diesel from? Now Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, coming out of the Persian Gulf, Russia. So the United States is not energy independent, as Trump's claiming. It's in fact energy dependent on diesel, which is the most important fuel in the economy, because it runs the trucks that haul the products from store to store to store. So that's where, Trump is just, either he doesn't understand and he's being told a lie, or he does understand that and he's just lying himself. I don't know which it is.
How serious is this issue for Donald Trump? On one hand, he insists the Strait of Hormuz must be fully open with no restrictions or tolls, while on the other, he argues the U.S. no longer depends on it in the same way due to domestic energy production. So what is the real objective behind this position? And how do you interpret the broader diplomatic push, including Marco Rubio's appeal to the UN? What exactly is Washington trying to achieve in terms of control over this key waterway? And is there a contradiction in how the situation is being framed?
Last I checked, it's the United States that's firing on commercial vessels, firing missiles into engine rooms. That's not Iran, that's the United States. So yeah, he should be outraged at what his own country is doing. The whole economic phenomena of it's not just the closing of the Strait of Hormuz, but it was the damage that's inflicted on the energy, and I'll call it the commodity infrastructure in Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar in particular, United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia. We don't have any reference point in history to point to about what the full consequences, effects of this are. That we have never, in the last, let's say 150 years. So, or let's count that the oil, the start of oil in the world economy. Did it start becoming an issue like 1890? Let's go to 1900. So 126 years. We've never had a situation where 20% of the world's oil supply got cut off. So that's cut off. There's no more out. It's not a matter of flipping a switch and producing more. We've gone from this level down. So 20% of that's gone. 10% of liquid natural gas, again, that's provided by Qatar. That was their principal export. That's no longer available. The production of helium, 44% of that is off the market. And when you consider helium as a critical ingredient for manufacturing computer chips, and what we're witnessing is now with the advent of AI and the so-called AI revolution, that is AI revolution is driven by having computers that are in these data centers. And so those computers have to have computer chips. And what's happened to the computer chip market? It's not, instead, the prices on it are soaring now because there's a shortage of chips, because the price of the helium is actually, it's off the market. It's not coming back anytime soon. Same thing then with, we're finding that with fertilizer, the combination of urea and sulfur, those two items, which also came out of the Persian Gulf. So my point is, the world has never seen a disruption in the supply chain like this in modern history. You know, in the last 126 years, we've never seen it. So we can't necessarily sit down and say, okay, this is how these effects are going to play out, because we have no record of that ever happening. We're going to discover how it's going to play out, but you can make a prediction that I think is reasonable, that if you have now cut off that supply, then the other products that are made from those basic items, those are going to decrease in supply, and the prices of them are going to go up. So at a minimum, we're going to see a major inflationary spike globally, not just in one country, globally. And even though the United States is a net exporter of this light crude, we're still we're finding we're having to pay a lot more for diesel. So that price is going up. And because there's a shortage of oil, even the light crude in some areas, more competition from other countries wanting to buy that. So we're looking at a minimum of both increased inflation and a slowdown in the economy, ergo what's known as stagflation.
Does anybody in Israel care about what you've just said?
No, in Israel, they're on, they're like your teenage kid. When your kids get old enough to go to college and you give them a credit card, okay, here, and then you don't yell at them about being mindful of their spending. You just let them spend whatever, and you pick up the bill. That's Israel with the United States. Israel can do whatever the hell it wants. The United States picks up the bill. Israel never has to pay.
The message coming from Lebanon and Hezbollah seems to be that as long as Israeli forces remain in southern Lebanon, rocket fire into northern Israel will continue. That creates a cycle where neither side appears willing to adjust its core position, and the situation becomes self-reinforcing. Do you see any real willingness in the United States to pressure Israel toward a policy shift in southern Lebanon, or has that option effectively been taken off the table?
Well, that's what Iran now has done, and I'm seeing the headlines over my computer here, and so they're closing the Bab el-Mandab. They are shutting down now. They said they're going to stop all traffic coming out of the Strait of Hormuz. So up to this point, Iran was allowing ships to pass, and ships were, paying the fee. But now, accordingly, if the news is accurate, Iran said nothing's going to get out. So they're going to really shut it down. So, the combination of those two factors means that the global effect on the world economy is it's going to be real now. That they can't pretend that, this is just temporary. It's not temporary. So this is going to force the United States to act, to put pressure. Well, what it ought to do, and I'm not sure it will, it ought to force Trump to call Netanyahu up and say, cut this shit out now. And you're going to end your attacks on Lebanon now. That's going to stop. We're cutting off all aid now. Okay, so that would be a move in the right direction. That would then provide an opening for the United States and Iran to get back to talks. But I don't see that happening, at least this week. And I think in the face of this challenge by Iran, the United States is going to ramp up. So we're seeing today that this is, this situation now, it's going to get worse. We've had, sort of, let's call it 8 weeks of calmness, so to speak. At least, Iranians have not been dying. So more Iranians are going to die. But this also means Saudi Arabia, Qatar, they're going to have a choice to make. They're going to either shut down U.S. military operations from their territory, or if they allow those military operations from the territory, like Kuwait is, they're going to be attacked. They're going to suffer significant damage beyond what they've already suffered.
You're arguing that while both Russia and Ukraine now perceive existential stakes in the conflict, the responsibility for de-escalation ultimately sits with NATO countries, since the original security competition was triggered through earlier policy decisions and expansion choices that were widely understood to carry escalation risks. If NATO is the actor with the most leverage to de-escalate, what incentives or political shifts would actually be required for that reassessment to happen before the conflict becomes even more entrenched?
We know, and it's so interesting and ironic given what former Chancellor Merkel has just said in the last few days again, how much we knew about the provocations that NATO was making. Because this goes back to 2014 when the U.S. really gave a big nudge to a coup in support of a coup that turned Ukraine from a neutral country to a very dramatically pro-NATO expansionist country. But before that coup, 6 years before, came the decisive event that even triggered what happened in 2014, and that was the commitment that NATO made that it would enlarge to Ukraine and to Georgia, made at the Bucharest NATO summit in 2008. And at that summit, George W. Bush Jr. was pushing, and especially this was because of his neoconservative gang around him, led by his Vice President Cheney, that NATO would enlarge. And the Europeans then knew how dangerous and reckless this was. And in fact, I've been told by one of Europe's leaders today, whom I won't name so as not to embarrass, but I was told very explicitly that the European leadership was promised just before the Bucharest summit that the United States would pull no such stunt of trying to demand an enlargement of NATO to Ukraine. But when they got to the Bucharest summit, the U.S. was out in full force. George Bush said, "We will commit." And Chancellor Merkel has written about this in detail. And she says that she knew that committing to a timeline for NATO enlargement to Ukraine was tantamount to a declaration of war on Russia, that that's how the Russians would see it. And she resisted this commitment the first day of the summit. But then the Americans wore her down. And on the second day, while the NATO summit did not commit to a specific timeline, a so-called map, which would lay out precisely the timeline, it committed in no uncertain terms to the enlargement to NATO. And she wrote in her memoirs that she knew that such a commitment was reckless. The reason I say that this is ironic is that just in recent days, she said that she hopes that the war in Ukraine stops sometime within the next 10 years. What? Are we so incapable of human beings that we accept a timeline of 10 more years of war? Why not 10 days or 10 hours, understanding all of the mistakes that have been made and come up with a formula to end this that has to be based, by the way, on what was, is, and remains the core issue of this war, which is Ukraine's neutrality. The West should understand this. Absolutely must, or we'll have a war if it doesn't understand this. We'll have a war in Europe, I mean. By the way, I think we've talked about it, but I'd like to discuss it in this context because the warmongering and irrationality and danger and recklessness and shallowness and immaturity of the people who lead us is something to behold. In December 2021, when President Putin, in a final attempt to press the new Biden administration to recognize the commitment of no NATO enlargement that had been made 30 years earlier, and to stop this war that was already 7 years underway in Ukraine, to press the United States to say NATO won't enlarge. And President Putin put a draft security arrangement between Russia and the United States on the table in mid-December. I think it's December 17, if I remember correctly, 2021. And, well, there were things that I don't think NATO would ever have accepted, or the U.S. would have accepted, about rolling back some of the existing placements. What absolutely struck me as core and correct was that the United States at that point should say, yes, you know, NATO's not going to enlarge any farther into Ukraine, much less into the South Caucasus region, which, by the way, is still in play by the CIA and the United States. Even as we speak right now, they're playing games in Armenia, they're playing games in the South Caucasus. But let me not digress. I called the White House and I spoke to the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, and I had the most surrealistic conversation imaginable. I think we may have talked about it, but we spoke for an hour. We spoke in detail. And I said, Jake, take the deal. Say NATO's not going to enlarge. It's a terrible idea. It's not in America's interest. It's not in Ukraine's interest. Take the deal. And he said to me, Jeff, NATO's not going to enlarge to Ukraine. I said, Jake, what? NATO's not going to enlarge. I said, fine, say it. No, we can't say it. It's our open door policy. I said, Jake, you're going to have a war over something that isn't going to happen? He said, Jeff, there's not going to be a war. We're going to handle this diplomatically. Don't worry, there's not going to be a war. What can one make of this almost 5 years later? First, the incompetence is shocking. The brazenness is shocking. The naivete is shocking. It's so distressing to have conversations like that. Not one word of it made sense. Yet, I think that actually was American policy. NATO's not going to enlarge, but we're not going to say it, but we're not going to have a war. Like everything, every premise of it made no sense and was quickly disproved. And here we are with an ongoing war that's now the war has since 2014, let's be clear, but this escalation is since February 2022, so more than 4 years. And now we hear Chancellor Merkel, who I always liked, I have to say. She's saying, well, she hopes it won't be 10 more years. What is it? Is something so wrong in the European mentality that war is so normalized? You can believe it. Europe has been at war essentially since maybe 300 AD, since the Germanic tribes made their incursions into the Roman Empire, and since 476 when Western Europe splintered with the end of the Roman Empire. It's never been really at peace for, as it should be. It's had stretches that were much better. But what kind of mentality? Rather than saying, oh my God, this could go on for another 10 weeks. That's horrible. We have to do something. I hope that it won't go on for another 10 years. I may be misunderstanding the quote. I tried to get the exact meaning of it. But whatever it is, it was a rather plaintive, complacent, and not complacent, but plaintive view that, oh, we're just stuck by these forces of opposition, and it's just a long, hard slog. Well, try sitting down diplomatically. Understand all of the lies that were told. And just to say some of the others that I mentioned that are of relevance, in the context of the coup in Maidan on February 21st, 2014, the German foreign minister and his French and Polish counterparts negotiated with President Yanukovych that there would be no coup, that President Yanukovych would remain in power under the constitutional order, and that there would be elections late in 2014. The next day, a violent coup came. You might think that the United States and Germany and Poland and France would say, no, we don't accept a violent coup. Ukraine is a constitutional democracy, and President Yanukovych remains president. Of course, they didn't say that. The U.S. was rubbing its hands together. We got him. Now we're going to go for NATO enlargement. Immediately, the post-coup regime said, well, maybe Russia shouldn't stay in Sevastopol and Crimea. Maybe it's time to unwind that lease for their naval base and so forth. You saw the plot straight out. What did Germany do in that context? Nothing except go along. So that was another cheat. And then a year later, in February 2015, when the war had already started, when people were dying in the Donbass, Chancellor Merkel and President Hollande personally negotiated an arrangement to end the war called the Minsk II Agreement. And it happened to be based on an idea of autonomy for the ethnic Russian population of eastern Ukraine. And I happen to know also, interestingly, that Chancellor Merkel viewed that as quite a good alternative because she knew about the German enclave in South Tyrol in northern Italy, which is another case of an autonomous region in Europe at peace, but given autonomy because it's an ethnically autonomous part of Italy. Italy had taken some territory of the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the end of World War I, a German-speaking part near Bolzano or around Bolzano. And they now have autonomy and everything works out well. So Chancellor Merkel said, this is how to end the crisis in the Donbass, give autonomy. Well, Germany negotiated it. Germany presented itself as the guarantor together with France in the so-called Normandy process. And Germany reneged on its guarantor role. I happen to know the United States didn't like it. Ukraine should be a unitary state. We don't want this autonomy. Don't weaken Ukraine. In other words, don't follow through on exactly what you've just signed and what has just been unanimously ratified by the UN Security Council. because the Minsk II agreement is not only an agreement inside Ukraine, but it was an agreement endorsed by the UN Security Council and then blown off. Years later, Chancellor Merkel said, well, yes, we didn't really expect it to work. It was going to give time for Ukraine to build up its strength. I actually don't believe that that was her motivation back in February 2015. I think it's a strange kind of ex post rationalization of events. But whatever it is, there was duplicity in the end. Well, all of this, Glenn, is to say, I don't know whether Chancellor Merz knows any of this. I don't know whether he does his homework. I don't know whether he's aware of history, but he is the Chancellor of Germany, and he has a responsibility to all of us, actually, to behave like a responsible Chancellor of Germany. And that means knowing these events, understanding that there's no purity of the European side, that there's plenty to talk about for true mutual security in Europe, and that as Chancellor, he has a responsibility not to be a warmonger. He has a responsibility to pick up the phone or dial his Zoom and connect with his counterpart, President Putin.
You're pointing to a long sequence of failed or reversed diplomatic efforts, from Minsk to election dynamics to stalled negotiations and repeated breakdowns in talks, that in your view contributed to a gradual escalation rather than de-escalation, and now appears to have crossed into a phase where both sides treat the conflict less as a proxy situation and more as a direct confrontation. At this stage, is there still any realistic diplomatic off-ramp left, or has the accumulation of mistrust and escalation already pushed both Europe and Russia past the point where diplomacy can meaningfully reset the situation?
It is, and one wonders how can this happen in a world of open communication, our discussion, or the ability, thank goodness, that I can still publish an open letter in an important German outlet, the Berliner Zeitung. But what I can tell you, what we know is our governments are in a bunker already. They don't talk to the public. They don't engage in any discussion of what we're discussing right now. They won't answer. Of course, Chancellor Merz is not going to answer me. That goes without saying. But in general, they simply have hunkered down and operate without responsibility. It's hard to imagine because we have all of the trappings of democracy. We have the trappings of accountability. But I know, because I experience it daily, you do as well, there simply is no response. If I call a senior official in the European Commission, I don't get an answer. I don't get a callback. They know who I am. I've been dealing with the European Commission for 40 years in one way or another. I've been dealing at a personal level with many of these people. They simply will not speak anymore. Leaders that I know will not speak. They are hunkered down. They cannot defend their position. They cannot rationalize it. All they can do is propagandize in one direction and call the rest of us whatever names they want, or use sanctions or whatever they do, which they do occasionally as well, against certain people. But what we don't have, even within our own countries right now, is open discussion. And this, I think, is not, it's just an explanation of how we go day by day with falsehoods hanging in the air, unresolved, because they don't try to resolve them. There's no independent look or commissions or responses or answers to Parliament. There's no inquiries into anything. It's a very, very dangerous situation, because the normal processes of truth-telling or analysis, or what diplomats are especially important for, understanding how the other side thinks and explaining that straightforwardly. And if there is something wrong with how the other side thinks, discussing it together with the other side to try at least to clarify. None of these processes happens right now. So I was at this is anecdotal and it's years ago, but for me, it's what we see every moment. I was invited by the G7 foreign ministers to speak to them. Well, I was invited by the host country at the time, which was Indonesia, to speak to the G20 foreign ministers. And this was after the invasion. They would not speak with Foreign Minister Lavrov. So here are foreign ministers. It's their job. That's why they're there. And they would not even speak to the Russian foreign minister. This is the idea. You do not engage in actual communication, much less diplomacy and negotiation. And I don't really understand what the motivations are. People have various explanations. We can say the publics are disgusted by this, broadly speaking. Mertz's popularity is, essentially in complete collapse. Macron's popularity is essentially in complete collapse. Starmer's popularity is essentially in complete collapse. It's not as if these people are expressing the will of their publics. Absolutely the opposite. And so then it raises all sorts of questions. Some people say, well, Mertz, he's BlackRock. I don't know if that's the explanation or not. He's the German military industry. Who knows? It seems doubtful to me. These explanations so simplistic, but frankly, I don't have a better one because the behavior is so bizarre at this point, so counterproductive and so dangerous. And we have to keep the core message to the Europeans. You said you were going to talk. You said you were going to find an intermediary. For heaven's sake, 450 million people in the European Union, find someone and get started.
We're seeing a growing strain on U.S. leadership within NATO, particularly when it comes to managing escalation risks and avoiding wider conflicts. That raises questions about whether the alliance structure is still effectively aligned with its original stabilizing role. Is this difficulty in staying out of wars a structural issue inside NATO leadership, or a reflection of broader shifts in how the U.S. approaches global security commitments?
This stuff is coming home, too. It's coming home to the United States. You can't fight wars overseas, basically, without some of the violence and some of the attitudes that are developed in wars like this coming home. And I keep telling people, this is a country that has not had bombs dropped in its front yard since 1865. And, we had 12 million men or 16 million men, depending on how you count them, in World War II. They were overseas. There was nothing on our soil of consequence. A few firebombs floated over by the Japanese to the Pacific coast, a little bit of action in the Aleutians, which stopped very quickly when we took action against it. And there was a little on the East Coast with a few Nazi spies and this, that, and the other thing. But no American in 3 or 4 generations has had bombs in his front yard. None. We just don't know what it's like to be in a place like Ukraine, or in a place like Gaza, or in a place like the West Bank, or a place like Lebanon. We simply do not know. We fought all our wars at arm's length. What kind of thing is going to happen to the empire when it comes here? And it might come here for domestic reasons, not necessarily some foreign power attacking us. That could happen. It certainly could happen with a dirty bomb or something like that coming across one of our borders. But that would be the excuse for the invocation of the Insurrection Act, the declaration of martial law, and we'd be off to the races, because I think that's what the domestic agenda of this administration is, led by none other than your favorite Secretary of War, he whom Trump likes to hold up as a movie star image of a killer, Pete Hegseth.
There does seem to be a broader sense, even among some establishment voices, that the U.S. system is facing signs of overextension, not just militarily, but across multiple fronts simultaneously: Ukraine, Iran, China, and other regional pressure points. While the military dimension is most visible, the strain also shows up in coordination, resources, and the ability to sustain multiple long-term strategic commitments at once. Beyond the military aspect, where do you see the most significant structural erosion of U.S. influence happening right now? Financially, diplomatically, or in its ability to coordinate a coherent global strategy?
I think an article that appeared in a publication put out by Win Without War, I believe it was, I think I've got the author's name, Nicholas Davies. The title of the article is very pertinent, and the article itself is eloquent. The title is, "Do U.S. War Crimes Doom the World to Endless War and Chaos?" And the answer to that question, I think, is absolutely. And that's what's happening. We are destroying international law. We are destroying everything that we built up after World War II, that Franklin Roosevelt talked about at Yalta, that Eisenhower was very instrumental in helping to build, that Harry Truman was 100% behind, that the United States became the real look to, if not the actual, and in many cases we were the actual power behind that law. If Mao was right that international law comes out of the barrel of a gun, and I think to an extent he was, that gun was owned by the power that had dramatically supplied all of the United Nations, and that's the term we used at the time, not allies. We call them the United Nations. Eisenhower used that term. Marshall used that term. We supplied all of those powers that wound up being, quote, victorious, unquote, on our side. They were prostrate at the end of it, most of them. Britain certainly was. The Soviet Union was. France was. Japan, an enemy, was. We were the titan in the world, and we put the titan's weight on the Security Council, often thwarted by others, mostly Russia when it was in their interest to do so. But we were the titan behind international law. We were the law. However imperfect that was, there was law. Now, as that title implies in Davies' article, and I think he's right, we have destroyed it. Not only have we destroyed it, we have had a president who impugned it, a president who disregards it. His mind is more important than the law. James Madison is spinning in his grave. If men were angels, they wouldn't need governments and they wouldn't need laws. Well, we destroyed international law, and we are working hard to destroy U.S. law, constitutional and otherwise. What goes on overseas comes home. That's almost an axiom of our wars. And we have been at war for the past 30 years, if you count them off, and all the people we've destroyed, hurt, put into either internal displacement or external displacement, or killed. 38 million is one analysis of how many people we have killed with our sanctions, 50% or more of which were women and children, since 9/11. 38 million people. That rivals Mao Zedong in the Cultural Revolution. That rivals Stalin in the purges, in the deepest, darkest hours of the purges. It even rivals Hitler, really, when you talk about the people he personally or his Wehrmacht and other forces killed. 100 million total, but probably somewhere between 30 and 40 at Hitler's door personally. So we are the rival of those people and the people that we have killed with our sanctions since 9/11. We are no longer the arbiter of international law, good or bad. We are no longer the world's protector, good or bad. And I would argue that for a long time, there was more good to it than bad. Now we are just all bad. We are all evil. And we sponsor people who are even more evil than we, like Israel.
The discussion points to a situation in which the scale and visibility of destruction in multiple theaters, from Lebanon to broader regional conflicts, are increasingly difficult to frame or minimize in traditional Cold War narratives, especially as more information enters the public domain outside mainstream channels. How do you assess the broader geopolitical and reputational impact of these developments on Israel's position internationally? And does this level of exposure change anything in terms of how the conflict is politically sustained or justified?
Well, I take Lindsey Graham to heart when he says that if they weren't doing it, we'd have to be there doing it. And were the forces doing it for us composed of Lindsey Grahams, I have no doubt that if they could overcome their cowardice, they would be doing that. And that's one point you've got to make about these people. I mean, I'm sorry. These are not the most courageous, bravest warriors in the world who make it their practice on a daily basis to kill men, women, and children. Now, I will admit in Iraq, in Somalia, in Afghanistan, in Libya and elsewhere, we were responsible directly or indirectly for a lot of women and children being killed. But I don't think we ever walked out on a battlefield with a Marine or a soldier or a sailor or an airman whose purpose in life, there may have been some aberrations, there always are, but at large, purpose in life was killing women and children. These people's purpose in life is killing women and children because they will tell you they have the wombs or the potential to grow up, and they will be terrorists or they will produce terrorists. That's the kind of language I hear out of these people. They remind me of some of the neoconservatives in this country who would say the same thing for the top page of the New York Times, right side above the fold, if they could get away with it and maintain their jobs, because that's the way they feel. Kill them all, slaughter them all, as my lieutenant in George Washington University seminar told me about his 2 years in the IDF and his time in Operation Cast Lead, which was a couple, 3 weeks of preparation for what you're seeing post October the 7th in Gaza. Always planned to be done eventually on October the 7th, whatever its inception was. October the 7th, like 9/11 for us, gave the Israelis the excuse to go out and put Operation Cast Lead into play across the whole breadth of Gaza. That's what they're doing, and they've been planning it for a long time, and they are bloody-minded about completing it. Naftali Bennett, what has Naftali Bennett been accusing Netanyahu of? Not finishing off the Palestinians in Gaza, not finishing off Hamas. Go down in those tunnels and kill Hamas, get them out of those tunnels, kill them. And Bibi and the IDF, and I don't blame them, are content to stay up above ground and kill them piecemeal during a ceasefire and belie any kind of humanitarian aid, really, that could get in there and help. Even got cheating going on right now with Israelis and Palestinians making money off the cheating. That'll always happen. But humanitarian assistance in there now is sort of a joke amongst the relief agencies that really know how to do it and know what's going on there. So this is just terrible, all the way from East Jerusalem, across Gaza, the West Bank, into Lebanon. He'd be in Syria if he had enough troops to take that on at the same time, too. He's only got a holding force in Syria, and then Iran. And I'm sure Bibi would tell Trump that at any moment that Trump wants to march ground forces into Iran, he'll put the IDF, turn it around from Lebanon, put it on hold in Lebanon, and go on and join him with the ground forces in Iran. I almost wish he would, because they get swallowed up and murdered. I hate to say that, but it would probably be the end of the IDF. But that's whom we're dealing with. And now I'm trying to figure out, have I been right that Israel has all along been our tool? Or are other people right that we're their tool? I think the two have had moments where each was operative, and now they've merged. It doesn't really matter because we're both criminal.
It's a pretty stark framing, where the argument is that the dynamics in West Asia are no longer isolated, but are feeding into a wider global shift in perception and power, especially since October 7th and the subsequent escalation cycles. The sense is that the traditional ability of the US and Israel to shape the narrative is increasingly under strain, even as the conflict itself expands and intensifies. Are we actually witnessing a structural shift in global perception and power balance, or is this still an early phase of a longer process where the old system is simply adapting to regain control?
Well, I don't for a moment attribute the same kind of almost evil genius to Donald Trump that I would to Bibi Netanyahu. I mean, you don't stay in power as long as he stayed in power in a volatile Jewish state like Israel. And I say that with emphasis on the Jewish because I don't think the Arabs really have much say in it. And of course, there are more Arab Palestinians plus Christians and others in Israel than there are Jews by a slight amount. I suspect it's more than 1 million now because I think 1 million Jews have left. They voted with their feet, and I don't think they're coming back. But I think what we're looking at now is a situation where the United States is so locked in this, and we're led by a person who really does not understand, except for the pecuniary aspects of it, where he and his family are making tons and tons of money. I don't know if you saw that story this morning. This is sort of an aside, but it's indicative about the $40 million in gold and Rolex watches and other things that they found in this CIA agent's home. And now the agency is saying that, you know, there were some circumstances in hiring him that weren't copacetic. And all, I mean, this, you can't make this up. You know where he got that? He got that in Ukraine. And I, as I told my daughter this morning, you know, you could go to Ukraine as a CIA operative, and if you really had sticky fingers, you could pick up $40 million in gold overnight, virtually, and walk out with it. I'm the man who saw 16 billion US dollars go on pallets on a C-130 and get shipped to Iraq and disappear. $16 billion. So there's more money lying around in Ukraine you could shake a stick at, but it's indicative of what you and I are talking about, the corruption of all of these wars and the corruption associated with European and American support for Ukraine and Zelensky in particular, and what's happening in Israel and Lebanon and elsewhere, and what's happening in Georgia. We must not leave that out. They're still trying to overthrow that government. And what's happening adjacent to Kaliningrad and in the Baltic in general and on up to the Arctic. We are painting a tapestry that the Chinese and others in the world who are about to meet in India in September with the BRICS meeting, Modi in charge, they can't figure out, I don't think. But they know they're winning and they don't want to do anything to disturb that victory. So you have the kind of advice coming out of Xi Jinping, I suspect, that goes something like this. If you can damage them, but don't damage them in such a way that it reflects back on us or causes them to respond against us, which is why Xi told a whole bunch of lies to Trump with regard to support for Iran. Of course, he's supporting Iran. Is he doing it through third countries? Well, how else would you do it and get away from, the patrols and so forth? And is he doing it with overhead satellites? Well, probably so. And is Russia doing it? Well, probably so. Are they doing things because they feel like they have to protect Iran? Yeah, to a certain extent, but mostly it boils down to protecting their own interests, particularly China's interests with regard to the railroad to Iran and so forth. So we're up against them in Ukraine. We're up against them in Iran. We're up against them largely everywhere we go. Were we to try and take Cuba, I bet you we would probably be up against them there, one or both of them. I hope we don't do that. So why are we doing this? This is a huge question. Why are we doing this? Is it just to make money for Trump's family and Trump himself? Is that the only reason we're destroying the domestic environment of this country, destroying international law, waging war and killing people for no purpose whatsoever except money? I can't figure it out. I can't say that enough. People don't like that as an answer, but I'm sorry. This is, in many ways, that old word, ineluctable. You can't figure out what's happening because it is so base. B-A-S-E, base, as in depraved, as in broken, as in nonsensical, illogical, except that a lot of people are making money.
It does seem like there's a broader argument being made that traditional markers of full-spectrum dominance, are increasingly harder to demonstrate in practice, especially when strategic choke points or regional outcomes appear less controllable than in earlier periods of U.S. power projection. At the same time, there's a perception that financial systems and economic leverage are becoming more central tools of influence than direct military outcomes. Are we actually seeing a structural shift where economic power overtakes military dominance in shaping global outcomes? Or is this more of a transitional phase in how imperial power is being exercised under new constraints like nuclear deterrence?
Yeah, that's the one that scares me, is the nuclear weapons. No treaties and 10,000 or more between us and Russia. That's a hell of a lot of nuclear, enough to destroy the world several times over. And the other thing that truly troubles me, and I can't emphasize this enough, is the profoundly inept leadership we have right now. You can say it's superb in grifting, superb in manipulating the stock market for money, superb in using the taxpayers' dollars for its own purposes, either personal or what it calls national purposes, what the Congress is becoming, even in the Republican part, more and more skeptical of, particularly these things like this 1.6 or whatever $billion fund to pay back all the people who participated in January the 6th, which got even Thune, the majority leader in the Senate, up on his back legs. But all of that is going on right now, and there seems to be no counterpunch. There seems to be no effort that is meaningful to right the ship of state, to use a metaphor. I'm not sure it can be righted, but I don't see anybody actually trying to do it. And that's extremely worrisome. And then you come back to what you pointed out, you come back to the nuclear weapons and the desperation we're going to feel at one point here, probably not too far into the future, maybe even in my lifetime. This desperation is going to be so deep and so all-encompassing that we're going to start something that we can only finish with nuclear weapons.